ever wonder why, even in the age of like smartphones and going to space,
Yeah.
the world still seems like it's driven by the
Yeah.
same old power struggles? It's like
Yeah.
we're stuck in this cycle of
Yeah.
rivalry and distrust and this jockeying for control.
Yeah. It's a fascinating puzzle,
Yes,
isn't it?
totally.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Okay.
We are diving into John Mearsheimer's The Tragedy of Great Power Politics,
Okay.
a book that challenges the common view that we are living in a more peaceful and cooperative world than ever before.
Right. It's tempting to think that things
Yeah.
are getting better.
Yeah.
Like, we haven't seen a major war between, like, the big powers since the Cold War.
Exactly.
So it's like,
Yeah.
maybe we're in a good spot.
Right. Mearsheimer would say that that's more
Yeah.
a temporary lull than
Yeah.
a fundamental shift.
Okay.
He says we're still operating within a system where power is king,
Right.
and that's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so, like, if you're starting from scratch with this,
Yeah.
how does he kind of set the table?
So think of it like this.
Yeah.
Mearsheimer is a realist.
Okay.
He believes the international system is inherently anarchic.
Okay.
There's no global police force,
Yeah.
no real authority to enforce rules or prevent conflict.
Right.
So states are left to their own devices,
Okay.
and their primary goal is survival.
I got that.
Yeah.
But why do states need to be so aggressive? Can't they all just, like, get along?
Right, that's where offensive realism comes in.
Okay.
So Mearsheimer argues that states are constantly seeking to maximize their power,
Okay.
not just to survive, but to dominate.
Mm-hmm.
They see the world as like a game of chess,
Okay.
and they're always making moves to gain an advantage,
Yeah.
even if it means creating instability for others.
So it's not just about being safe. It's
Yeah.
about being, like, the most powerful player.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And that creates what's called a security dilemma.
Okay.
The more one state tries to protect itself, the more insecure other states feel,
Mm-hmm.
leading to a spiral of mistrust and arms races.
Okay.
So it's kind of this vicious cycle.
So according to him,
Yeah,
this constant drive for power makes the world inherently prone to conflict.
absolutely.
Is that the tragedy that he's talking about?
That's the tragedy,
Right, yeah.
because in this system, even if no one wants war,
Mm-hmm.
the very pursuit of power makes conflict more likely.
Yeah.
It's like a pressure cooker,
Right.
where tensions keep building until something finally explodes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
It's a bleak picture.
yeah, a little bleak.
Yeah.
But before we go further down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
let's take a step back and talk about like the main players in this game.
Okay.
Mearsheimer argues that there are two major schools of thought on international relations:
Yeah.
realism and liberalism.
You got it.
So tell me about those.
So realism focuses on the struggle for power.
Okay.
It sees the world as a brutal and competitive arena where states are constantly vying for dominance.
Okay.
Liberalism, on the other hand, emphasizes cooperation institutions and the role of democracy in promoting peace.
So realists are the pessimists and liberals are the optimists.
That's a simplification, but it captures the essence of the debate.
Okay.
Realists see the world as a zero-sum game,
Mhm.
where one state's gain is another's loss.
Okay.
Liberals believe that cooperation is possible and that institutions can help to manage conflict.
Right. So they both have very different perspectives on how the world works.
Exactly.
But he's arguing that realism still has a lot of relevance in today's world.
Yes.
And he has all these historical examples to back it up.
That's right. He argues that even though the world has changed a lot since the Cold War,
Yeah.
the basic dynamics of power politics remain the same.
But how can that be?
Yeah.
I mean, the world seems way more interconnected now than it's ever been. We have
Yeah.
global institutions,
Yeah.
trade agreements, just
Mhm.
a ton of communication going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Mearsheimer would argue that these developments haven't fundamentally changed the way that states behave.
Okay.
They're still driven by self-interest,
Okay.
and they're still willing to use force to achieve their goals when it's in their best interest.
Okay. So what does that mean for us?
Yeah.
Like, do we just have to resign ourselves to a future where power politics is always going to dominate?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mearsheimer doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
He would say we need to understand the forces at play and be realistic about the challenges.
Okay.
And he would point to history for some pretty compelling evidence.
Okay, let's talk history then.
Okay.
Let's talk history then. The book dives deep into some pretty intense examples like Imperial Japan. You wouldn't think that a relatively small island nation could become such a dominant power in the early 20th century.
Right. It's a case study in how quickly things can change when a nation decides to pursue power relentlessly.
Yeah.
Remember, this is after the Meiji Restoration in 1868.
Mm-hmm.
Japan modernizes at an astonishing pace
Right.
and then embarks on this path of expansion.
Okay.
They conquer neighboring territories like Korea and Taiwan,
Yeah.
eventually even challenging established powers like Russia. They saw an opportunity to increase their power, and they seized it.
Wow.
Consequences be damned.
And that eventually led to Pearl Harbor, right? Talk about a high-stakes gamble for power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a desperate attempt to knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure resources in Southeast Asia. It was a miscalculation of epic proportions.
Yeah.
But it shows how the drive for dominance can lead to incredibly risky behavior.
Totally. It's like the saying, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. They went all in on military power, and it backfired spectacularly.
And that's the tragic irony of offensive realism.
Yeah.
The very pursuit of power,
Yeah.
the thing that's supposed to ensure survival, can actually lead to a state's downfall.
Right. Okay. So we've got Japan as one example.
Mhm.
What about Nazi Germany? That one seems like a no-brainer, right? Hitler was all about expansion and dominance.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Hitler's rise to power and his expansionist policies are practically textbook examples of offensive realism in action. He rearmed Germany, violated international norms, and ultimately plunged the world into a devastating war.
Right.
And remember his idea of Lebensraum.
Yeah.
That wasn't just about acquiring land, it was about securing resources and dominance for the German people.
Right. So in both of these cases, we see states driven by this like relentless pursuit of power,
Yeah.
leading to catastrophic consequences. But what about the Cold War?
Right?
That was a period of intense rivalry between, obviously, the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But thankfully, it never escalated into a full-blown war, even with nuclear weapons involved.
Ah, the Cold War. It's fascinating because it shows that even the threat of nuclear annihilation doesn't completely eliminate the logic of power politics.
Wow.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union were locked in this global struggle for dominance, constantly trying to outmaneuver each other. There were proxy wars, espionage, or a relentless arms race,
Right.
all driven by this underlying fear of the other gaining an advantage.
So even with like the potential for mutually assured destruction,
Right.
they were still playing this high-stakes game of chess
Exactly.
on a global scale. It makes you wonder if institutions like the United Nations were even effective during that time.
That's a great question.
Right.
Realists would argue that institutions are only as good as the states that support them.
Okay.
During the Cold War, the UN was often paralyzed by the rivalry between the superpowers.
Right.
It's like trying to referee a game where both teams are constantly trying to bend the rules in their favor.
So institutions can help manage conflict,
They can.
but they can't erase like the underlying forces driving it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the post-Cold War era.
Okay.
Many people saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as this victory for liberalism,
Yeah.
a sign that democracy and cooperation were on the rise. But Mearsheimer isn't so optimistic.
Really? What makes him so skeptical about that? It seems like things have been relatively peaceful since the end of the Cold War.
You're right, there hasn't been a major war between the great powers. But Mearsheimer would argue that that's more a product of circumstance than a fundamental shift in the nature of international politics. He points to things like arms races in Asia, conflicts in the Balkans, and the rise of new powers like China as evidence that the struggle for power is alive and well.
Okay, so the end of history might have been a bit premature.
Yeah.
We're not quite living in a world where everyone's singing Kumbaya just yet.
Not quite. Mearsheimer would say that we're simply in a new chapter of the same old story.
Okay.
The players may change, the technology may evolve, but that underlying logic of power politics remains this powerful force.
Yeah.
And when it comes to understanding that logic in the 21st century, there's one country that looms large in Mearsheimer's analysis: China.
China. The sleeping giant awakens, right? But why does China pose such a unique challenge? China, the sleeping giant, awakens, right? But why does China pose such a unique challenge?
It comes down to the shifting balance of power. As China's economy has boomed, its military capabilities have grown too, and this worries neighboring countries and, of course, the U.S., which has been the dominant force in the region for decades.
So China's getting stronger and others getting a little nervous. Sounds familiar, right? Kind of like Imperial Japan's rise, but on a much grander scale this time.
That's a good comparison.
Yeah.
And just like back then, this power shift increases the chances of miscalculations in conflict, even if no one actually wants a war, Mearsheimer argues that these transitions in power are inherently unstable.
Okay, so we're talking about like a potential clash of titans here. Does that mean we're headed for like a new Cold War, this time with China instead of the Soviet Union?
It's a possibility that Mearsheimer takes very seriously, though he'd say this time it's different. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is deeply integrated into the global economy. It's not so easy to just isolate them,
So it's a much more complex
or
situation.
it's much more complex.
But that doesn't mean conflict is inevitable, right? Couldn't the US and China find ways to cooperate even while they're competing for power?
Cooperation is always possible and definitely preferable. But offensive realism would argue that it's fragile in this system we've been talking about. Each side is constantly watching the other, calculating power moves, trying to predict the next 5 steps in the game.
Right.
And that can very easily lead back to that security dilemma that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, it's like they're both walking a tightrope trying to maintain their balance of power without tipping the whole thing over.
That's a great way to put it.
Talk about stressful.
Right. And according to Mearsheimer, this tightrope walk between the U.S. and China will be one of, if not the defining issue of the 21st century.
Uh-huh.
And he doesn't sugarcoat it. He believes that the very structure of the international system makes serious conflict more likely than not.
Okay, so that's a lot to process. For like those of us who aren't major players in the world stage, what does this all mean? Like, how are we supposed to make sense of it all?
It means understanding that history isn't over, that the struggle for power continues to shape the world around us, even in subtle ways.
Yeah.
So pay attention to those headlines about geopolitical tensions,
Hmm.
economic competition, even things like military exercises. They all fit into this larger puzzle.
So no more declaring the end of history.
Mhm.
Then we've got to stay engaged, keep learning, and be realistic about the challenges.
Precisely. And that's the real value of Mearsheimer's work, even if you don't agree with every conclusion. He forces us to confront the less comfortable aspects of international relations.
Right.
And who knows, maybe by understanding these forces, we can find ways to mitigate the worst outcomes and strive for a slightly less tragic future.
A bit of cautious optimism to leave us with. It has been quite the deep dive today, unpacking offensive realism, exploring those historical examples, and peeking into the future of great power politics.
It's fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even if you disagree with Mearsheimer, his framework gives you a powerful lens to analyze the world.
Yeah.
So next time you see a news story about international conflict, think about what's motivating the players involved. Who's trying to gain power? What are the potential consequences? You might be surprised by what you discover.
Absolutely. And on that note, it's time for us to surface from this deep dive. But keep those questions coming, dear listener, and keep exploring the world with a critical and engaged mind. Until next time.